I've never been one to get involved in neighborhood gossip, but what I'm about to tell you isn't something I could ignore. I've lived in a small 2-story home in the quiet town of Willow Creek with my husband, Daniel, for nearly 20 years. Our children have grown and moved out to pursue their own lives, and though I miss the hustle of a full house sometimes, I wouldn't trade the peace we've earned. Most days I spend my mornings on the front porch, knitting or reading, occasionally playing soft music in the background. Daniel often joins me with a cup of coffee, and we talk about the small things that make life pleasant. I also have a habit of listening to true crime podcasts, a guilty pleasure that sometimes keeps me up late, trying to understand the minds of people capable of terrible acts. It was a crisp spring afternoon when the house across the street was finally occupied. For months, it had stood empty, a quiet, watchful presence that I grew tired of staring at. The new resident introduced himself within a few days. His name was Lucas. Young, perhaps in his mid-20s, he had a confident way about him, and he drove a sleek black sports car that gleamed even in the muted sunlight. He dressed sharply, in the kind of clothing that made you think he either had a good deal of money or enjoyed creating that illusion. Despite my initial assumptions, he was genuinely kind. He introduced himself to Daniel and me warmly and made us feel welcome. Lucas worked in the entertainment industry, he said, freelancing for some online personalities. I didn't fully understand the details, but it sounded impressive. He and Daniel connected immediately, talking about sports and swapping stories about college days. I noticed Daniel laughing more in the past few weeks than he had in a long while. Lucas seemed intelligent, articulate, and polite, a young man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to show it. Over the next few months, things seemed normal. I waved to Lucas when he left his house, and he always waved back. It was a friendly, neighborly routine, nothing more. But soon, I began noticing a young woman appearing at his house at irregular intervals. She drove a small, white convertible and had long, blonde hair that shimmered in the sun. She dressed in a way that seemed more suited for a night out than casual visiting, and I assumed she was his girlfriend or at least a close friend. It was odd at first, seeing her there while Lucas wasn't home, but I shrugged it off. Young people had their own ways of doing things these days. Still, her visits were frequent, once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week. She didn't knock, she just let herself in, which struck me as unusual but not my business. Then one evening, I saw them together for the first time. Lucas had pulled into his driveway, and she was sitting in the passenger seat. That confirmed it. She was clearly involved with him in some way. Up until then, I had assumed she was just a friend or someone borrowing the house key temporarily. But shortly after that, the calm routine of the neighborhood began to unravel. One afternoon, while tending to my small garden, I heard raised voices from across the street. Lucas and the girl were in his driveway, shouting at each other. I couldn't catch the words, but the tension was palpable. She gestured wildly, her frustration almost tangible. I worried she might hit him, but instead she stormed off, slamming the car door and speeding away. Lucas shook his head and went inside, visibly drained. He hadn't noticed me. I assumed it was just a lover's quarrel and decided to mind my own business, though a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. The next few weeks carried a strange tension through the otherwise quiet streets of Willow Creek. I kept noticing that young woman, whose name I later learned was Mia, appearing outside Lucas's house while he wasn't home. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she had a copy of the key, or maybe Lucas simply trusted her. But the pattern was unsettling. Every time I saw her, she lingered at the front door or peered into the windows, and her expression wasn't friendly. It was calculating, patient, almost clinical. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch, sipping tea as the sun sank behind the trees. A sleek shadow of a car pulled into Lucas's driveway. It was Mia. Lucas wasn't in sight, and yet she went inside confidently, carrying herself as though she owned the place. My chest tightened. Something about the way she moved, so precise and deliberate, set off alarms in my mind. But Daniel, ever the voice of reason, shrugged it off. "Don't worry, dear. Young people have their secrets. It's not our place to pry." I nodded, though unease kept me restless that night. Days passed, and I began noticing other small oddities. Packages left at Lucas's door were opened or rearranged in ways that didn't make sense. He seemed more reserved when he came outside, no longer laughing as easily with Daniel. And the shouting, that happened more often. I could hear it faintly, even across the street. The arguments started as words, but soon gestures became sharp, movements abrupt. Mia's visits, once brief and seemingly innocent, extended into hours. I had no idea what was happening inside, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but curiosity gnawed at me. Then one late afternoon, I was trimming the roses along my fence when I heard a scream. It was high-pitched, desperate, the kind of scream that freezes your blood. I froze, heart pounding. It came from Lucas's driveway. I looked up just in time to see Mia storming out of the house, throwing her hands in the air as if daring him to follow. Lucas stood in the doorway, expression a mix of frustration and fear. She jumped into her convertible and sped away, tires squealing. For a long moment he stood there, silent, staring at the empty street. Then he went back inside. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, thinking of the scream and her reckless composure. What was really going on over there? I wanted to believe it was just a messy breakup, as Daniel suggested, but something about her presence felt dangerous. She wasn't just upset. She was deliberate, almost methodical. My thoughts kept drifting back to the way she had entered his home unannounced and stayed for hours, the way she seemed to observe everything. A few nights later, as I watched from the porch, I noticed her car parked in Lucas's driveway again while he wasn't home. My stomach sank. Daniel noticed my concern. "Maybe she's borrowing something or checking on him like you thought before. He trusts her." I nodded, but unease turned into worry. She lingered longer than usual, pacing near the front door, occasionally glancing toward the windows like she was waiting for something or someone. That's when I realized her visits weren't just casual. She was monitoring him. I tried to push the thought away, convincing myself it was paranoia. But the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. I began making excuses to stay closer to the front of the house, watching the movements across the street, heart thudding with every glance at Mia's car. Something about her composure, the way she carried herself, didn't fit the profile of a harmless girlfriend. And deep down, I feared that whatever was coming, we would see it unfold too late to stop it. It wasn't long before the tension escalated from unsettling to alarming. One afternoon, I was watering my front flower beds when I noticed Lucas walking home from a nearby cafe, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying more than just a bag. His usual confident gait was gone. Behind him, just a few minutes later, I saw Mia's car pull into the driveway. My heart sank. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't waving. She simply got out, her movements deliberate and precise, and went straight toward the front door. Lucas didn't notice. He was too engrossed in something on his phone. I considered calling Daniel over to watch with me, but before I could, Mia knocked on the door lightly, then paused, listening. When there was no response, she let herself in. My stomach churned. I didn't know what she was doing inside, but I had an ominous feeling it wasn't friendly. I stepped back behind the rose bushes, trying not to be seen, straining to catch any sounds. There was none, just the faint click of the door closing. That evening, Lucas came outside briefly, carrying his mail. He looked pale, tired, and his eyes darted toward Mia's car, which had now parked along the curb. I wanted to warn him, to shout across the street, but fear held me back. I couldn't risk making her aware that someone was watching. When he went back inside, I saw her silhouette moving past the windows, lingering in rooms where she shouldn't have been. She was inside, but Lucas didn't seem to notice. A week passed, and the situation deteriorated. The shouting returned, louder this time, echoing across the quiet street. One evening, I saw her standing in the driveway, her phone raised, pointing toward the house. I realized with a shock that she had somehow gained access to Lucas's personal devices. Every time he tried to pull away, she followed, her presence suffocating. I didn't know how she managed it, but I could sense it. The way he flinched, the way he avoided looking toward her window. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel and I were asleep when we were awakened by the shrill wail of sirens. Heart racing, we rushed outside in our pajamas, joining the small crowd of neighbors gathering on the street. Lucas's house was surrounded by flashing lights, police cars, an ambulance, a fire truck. The front lawn was a scene of chaos. Officers were moving quickly, carefully, as if expecting anything at any moment. From our vantage point, we saw them carry Mia out in handcuffs. She didn't struggle. She didn't yell. Her face was blank, unreadable, as though she had been expecting this outcome all along. My gaze immediately shifted to Lucas. He was being wheeled out on a stretcher, covered in blood. My chest tightened painfully. He looked fragile, almost ghostly, and I gasped aloud. I couldn't process the sight. My mind refused to understand how someone so seemingly bright and confident could be left in such a state. We didn't see Lucas again for nearly a week. The house across the street was silent, the once lively presence replaced by an uneasy stillness. Daniel and I worried incessantly, pacing in front of our own home, imagining the worst. When he finally returned, it was late in the evening. He allowed us in without hesitation and began to explain everything, his voice calm but haunted. What he told us would stay with me forever. When Lucas finally spoke to us, he tried to make sense of it himself. We sat in his living room, the once cheerful space now carrying a heaviness I had never seen before. He explained that Mia, her real name, as he discovered later was Ellie, had never been a casual girlfriend. From the very beginning, she had been observing him, studying his habits, and slowly inserting herself into his life without his knowledge. She had managed to duplicate his spare key and gain access to his house whenever she pleased. That explained the countless times I'd seen her entering while he wasn't home. It started small, Lucas said quietly, his hands trembling slightly. Little requests for dinners, gifts, trips. I thought she was just a demanding partner. I didn't see it as a warning. But her demands escalated. She became possessive, aggressive, and increasingly controlling. Every time he hesitated or resisted, her anger flared. Lucas confessed that the arguments I had overheard weren't just fights over trivial matters. They were his attempts to set boundaries. She refused to respect them. The most terrifying revelation came when he told us about the cameras. Hidden cameras. Every time she went to his house while he was away, she would check them, reposition them, and ensure they were functioning. She had been monitoring him constantly, seeing everything he did, knowing his every move. The realization made my skin crawl. Everything I had observed from my porch, every odd feeling, was only the surface of something much deeper. And the night she came after me, Lucas's voice faltered, the memory clearly painful. He told us he had decided to take a break from their relationship. He thought that would give him space to breathe, but Ellie had seen his plans through the cameras. The following night, she returned to the house, armed and determined. She wasn't just angry, she was methodical, prepared to punish him for defying her. He stopped himself before finishing the story, his expression haunted. "I barely made it out alive," he said. Daniel and I sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend the level of intrusion, manipulation, and danger Lucas had endured. The calm, quiet streets of Willow Creek had never seemed so fragile. I couldn't stop picturing her walking confidently into his home, knowing that he had no idea she had access, and my mind went back to the nights I had watched her linger in the driveway. How close had I been to seeing something even worse happen? Lucas explained that the police investigation had been straightforward once she was caught. Ellie confessed everything. The hidden cameras, the access to his phone, the obsessive monitoring, it all came out during questioning. Her calm, blank expression when she was taken away mirrored the control she had maintained over him for months. It was chilling. He admitted he had learned a hard lesson about trust and appearances. Money, flashy cars, or a charming personality could make someone a target for the wrong type of attention. That night, as Daniel and I walked home, I realized how fragile life could be. Lucas had been a bright, ambitious young man, full of potential and trust, and someone had exploited that trust in the most terrifying way. I prayed silently that he could recover, that the experience wouldn't steal too much from him, that he would find the strength to rebuild his life. After the terrifying night that changed everything, Lucas tried to return to his life, but it was impossible. The house that once felt safe now seemed like a trap, a reminder of every intrusion, every violation. Even the smallest noises, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside his window, set him on edge. Every glance toward the street made his chest tighten. He double-checked locks, passwords, cameras, even the motion sensors on his property. Daniel and I tried to reassure him, but it was clear. The fear had rooted itself deep, and it wasn't going away. Lucas's paranoia became a constant companion. He would pace the living room at night, staring out the window for any sign of movement. He stopped trusting casual knocks on his door or unexpected messages on his phone. Even friendly faces felt suspect. "I can't shake the thought that she's out there," he admitted one evening, voice tight with tension. Ellie had friends, people like her. Someone could be watching me right now, planning something I can't even see coming. His eyes darted toward the street with every passing shadow, and I could feel the pulse of fear radiating from him. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet of Willow Creek did little to soothe him. He stayed alert at all times, constantly checking windows and doors. Daniel and I helped as best we could, offering companionship, keeping him company while he worked from home, but even our presence didn't entirely calm him. Each time a car passed slowly by, each time a stranger lingered on the sidewalk, his heart rate spiked. It wasn't just residual fear from the attack. It was a new, gnawing anxiety that something worse could happen at any moment. Then came the call that made his worst fears tangible. Lucas had been notified through his lawyer that Ellie had somehow escaped custody. She had vanished without a trace, leaving the system baffled. And he realized this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. All those precautions, all the careful monitoring of his surroundings, suddenly felt insufficient. Every plan he had made to protect himself now seemed fragile, vulnerable. The thought of her returning, of finishing what she had started, gnawed at him like a living thing. Lucas became obsessive, constantly changing locations, rearranging locks, and even avoiding social media entirely. He stayed away from the familiar spots in town, avoiding his favorite cafe, the walking trail he once loved. Each night, he triple-checked his home's security, his phone, even his car. The paranoia was suffocating, but it was a response to a very real threat. Daniel and I watched helplessly, wishing we could offer more than advice and support. He was trapped in a state of vigilance, knowing that Ellie's obsession had not ended simply because she had been caught once. Despite the terror, Lucas showed remarkable determination. He refused to let fear completely dictate his life, taking cautious steps forward. But the shadow of Ellie loomed over every decision. Sleep was erratic, meals were skipped when he thought someone might be watching, and even brief moments of solitude were filled with anxiety. The danger that had once been abstract had become concrete again, a constant reminder that trust, once broken, can never fully return. By the time he decided to leave Willow Creek entirely, it was not just the memory of the attack that drove him away. It was the knowledge that Ellie was still out there, waiting, watching, and perhaps plotting her return. The house he once called home, the quiet streets, even the neighbors who had been kind. The entire life he had built now felt like a lure for someone who thrived on control. Leaving wasn't just an escape. It was a necessary step for survival. And yet, even as he packed his things, Even as the familiar landscape disappeared behind him, the sense of dread lingered. This nightmare, Lucas realized, might never truly end. 3 years had passed since Lucas fled Willow Creek. For Daniel and me, it felt like a distant, haunting memory, but for him, the fear had never fully faded. When he finally returned, it was clear how much he had endured in the interim. Over coffee in our kitchen, he told us about the years of constant movement, the relentless paranoia that had ruled his life. "I couldn't stay anywhere for long," he admitted, voice low. "Every time I thought I was safe, I'd receive another letter, another message. Threatening words, carefully crafted to remind me that she, or someone like her, was still out there." He had moved from city to city, renting apartments for a few months at a time, never putting down roots. Hotels, short-term leases, friends' couches. Anywhere he could find temporary refuge became home, if only briefly. It wasn't easy. The constant relocation, the careful scrutiny of neighbors and strangers alike, had taken a toll. He had grown tired, exhausted from living under a shadow that never lifted. And yet he had survived. "Last year," he continued, "the letters stopped. Completely. Not a single message, not a whisper. For the first time, I felt normal. Not safe, maybe, but not hunted. And that's when I knew I could come back to Willow Creek." There was a faint smile on his face as he said this, but I could see the cautious optimism behind it. Returning wasn't just a matter of homesickness. It was a calculated decision, made after years of living with vigilance and fear. This time, he hadn't returned alone. Sitting across from us, he gestured toward the doorway, and in walked a young woman named Clara. Her presence was warm, calm, and steady, everything Lucas had needed but hadn't known how to find in the tumultuous years following the attack. "I met her during one of my moves," he explained. She understands. She's patient, supportive, and she's helped me realize that I don't have to live like a fugitive forever." Clara smiled at us and offered a quiet, reassuring nod. It was easy to see the trust between them, the way Lucas relaxed slightly in her presence. She had been a stabilizing force, a partner who encouraged him to reclaim pieces of his life that fear had stolen. Together, they had found a modest house in Willow Creek, far enough from prying eyes, but close enough for Lucas to reconnect with the town he had once called home. The change in him was palpable. Where there had once been constant tension and vigilance, there was now careful, measured calm. He still checked doors and locks, still maintained an awareness of his surroundings, but the suffocating anxiety had eased. With Clara by his side, he could laugh more easily, sleep a little more soundly, and envision a future not dictated by fear. The past was never fully gone, but he was learning to live despite it. Watching him settle back into Willow Creek, I felt a sense of cautious relief. After years of running, after countless nights of uncertainty and dread, Lucas had finally begun to reclaim a life that wasn't defined by paranoia. And perhaps this time, with Clara supporting him, he could finally start to feel safe and even happy again. But the past has a way of lingering, and Clara, whose presence had seemed like a shield, was not who she appeared to be. One evening, Lucas prepared dinner for them both, chatting lightly about the peacefulness of the neighborhood. Clara smiled and responded gently, but there was something in her gaze he couldn't place, a subtle intensity he dismissed as lingering worry. Hours later, Lucas began to feel dizzy, his vision blurring. He stumbled to the counter, trying to call for Clara, but the room tilted around him. Panic surged through him as the realization hit too late. He had been poisoned. Clara watched silently, calm, almost clinical as he collapsed to the floor. He tried to speak, tried to ask why, but his strength failed him. The world dimmed, the room spinning until there was nothing but the echo of betrayal. Clara left the house shortly afterward, disappearing into the night with the cold efficiency of someone who had planned every step. Willow Creek would never suspect that the quiet woman living with him had ended his life. Weeks later, the truth began to surface. Investigations revealed a shocking connection. Clara was not a stranger. but Ellie's sister. Both women had severe psychological issues, driven by obsession and a need for control. Their plans had been meticulously calculated, their motives rooted in a shared instability. Authorities eventually tracked them down, but by then the sisters had already returned to Willow Creek, continuing the cycle of terror that had begun years earlier.